Went to the community college in Worthington for 2 quarters. And then I went to a place called the University of California at Berkeley. In 1974. Yeah. When my dad went with me to Berkeley, we flew into the Oakland airport, and the PDSP van came to pick us up. PDSP was the Physically Disabled Students Program. There were 2 men in the van. One man, his name was Hale Zukas. And Hale was very spastic, cerebral palsy. His arms were tied down, his legs were tied down, and he had a device attached onto his head. He looked like a human unicorn. That was how his joystick was mounted up here, and Hale moved his head around. Or that's how he controlled his chair. And the other man's name was Ed Roberts. For those of you that don't know who Ed was, Ed founded the first CIL. He founded the first CIL. He was in the process of doing that when I got to Berkeley. Ed Roberts and I became great friends. We were sitting at a track meet one day in 1974, in the spring of 1974. We were sitting fairly close together because Ed couldn't speak very loudly. His chair was tilted way back. He had a little function in his right hand. And his dog was with him, Tremor. It was a USA-USSR track meet. And I thought it was curious that he called his name Tremor, his dog Tremor, and I thought, well, you know, there's probably a reason for that. And I'm thinking, you live in the Bay Area, that maybe he calls it Tremor because of some, you know, earth-shattering experience he might have had, not really knowing. So at one point I asked Ed, I said, Ed, why do you call your dog Tremor? And Ed's speech, if you ever met Ed, you know that Ed's speech wasn't very, very good. He said, well, you'll find out. And the starting gun went off for a race, and Ed and I were sitting fairly close together. The starter's gun went off, and Tremor was lying around on the other side of Ed, and Tremor came around and squeezed in between the two of us and started shaking.
Oh, no.
I looked at Ed, and he just smiled. Right. We sat at a baseball game once. We were watching Cal play UCLA. And Ed was giving me information, telling me batting averages from people that were playing in the game. Information he'd gotten out of the paper that morning when he was sleeping in his, or lying in his iron lung while they were getting him ready. He lived in an iron lung. He was an amazing individual. And some people came up and they started talking to Ed about a bill that he had that he was pushing through the California Assembly at the time. And he started giving them the specifics about this bill that Ed was pushing. And he went from sports to politics just like that. And then when they left, we went back and talked sports again. And I was just so impressed with that. But he had an incredible mind. And I had no idea that the time that I spent with Ed was going to be as significant as it was. The first place I lived was called Cowell Memorial Hospital. It was a dormitory for disabled students. It had 12 of us. Some of you know the Courage Residence Program. This was way before that. Actually, the Courage Residence Program was designed, some of it was done as a result of what Ed had started in the mid-60s. He just wanted to go to college. You've seen the picture of Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. She was just tired and she didn't want to move. Ed wanted to go to college, and he managed to get them to let him go to school. They brought his iron lung into one wing of the Student Health Service. And eventually more and more students went to that program. And I got to live in that program. Well, for those of you that are old enough to remember, in February 1974, a young woman by the name of Patricia Hearst was kidnapped by a group called an urban terrorist group called the Sudanese Liberation Army. And her fiance, and folks, if you don't remember her fiance, you don't know what her fiance's name was. He had a great name for Berkeley in the mid-'70s. His name was Stephen Weed. Stephen Weed was a teaching assistant at Cal. I'm not making this up. You can't write this stuff. They brought Stephen Weed to the building that I lived in. There were 12 rooms on the 3rd floor of the West Wing. Yes, it was the West Wing. We like to refer to it as the left wing. 10 of us had broken our necks. 4 of us broke our necks playing football. And we learned from each other. But they brought Stephen Weed to the building. He was across the hall from me, and he was down 1 floor. And the SLA is threatening to blow him out of the building. They're going to blow the building up that I lived in. Cool. We all thought that was exciting. We'd already broken our necks. What else could happen? Nobody's ever going to blow up a building. And besides, at every elevator door, at every exit, there was an FBI agent sitting there with a trench coat over his lap, and you could usually see the ends of the sawed-off double-barrel shotgun sticking out from underneath the end of the trench coat. We're fine. I called, or actually I think Mom had called one Sunday afternoon. She had seen a story on the news about this Cowell Memorial Hospital under threat that somebody was going to blow the building up. She called, and on my speakerphone, I started talking to her, and she said, "Mike, isn't that the building you live in?" I said, "Yeah, isn't it cool?" We're on the news. But that conversation with Ed that day, and I lived in that building, and the next year, they stopped that program. This is a 1974-75 school year. They were in integration. Ed had started PDSP, Physically Disabled Students Program. They were in the process. Ed was done with school by then. And Ed was starting the first Center for Independent Living. The one that they brought, that they sent people out, that you sent people out to examine, to see how it worked. And I got to be a part of that. I wasn't a very big part of it, but I got to be a part of history, as I was so quaintly reminded by a young man at a youth leadership forum in Norfolk, Virginia a year ago, as I'm telling him after my presentation one night. We were there at a youth leadership program for kids with disabilities, and he said, "Wow," he said, "you're a part of history." Okay. I never really thought about it like that.